If you turn the clock back a few decades, the average Subaru buyer was either a hippie, a college professor, or a college professor hippie. It was basically a two-circle Venn diagram. But that's certainly not the case for the modern Subaru lineup. This 2024 Subaru Crosstrek is not just the best-selling Subaru in North America, it's the best-selling small crossover in North America, competing with the likes of the Corolla Cross, the Honda HR-V, and the Kia Seltos, just to name a few. That makes me wonder, is it the bestseller because it's the best, or is there some other reason? Is America full of hippie college professors in the 21st century? If you're watching this and you are a hippie college professor, thank you for your service. I wouldn't be where I am without you. And fun fact, the local state university that is closest to me has a banana slug as their mascot. How fun is that? Anyway, let's get to the Crosstrek right here. You'll notice that all Subarus tend to look very similar. I actually like that design theme. It makes this instantly recognizable as a Subaru, and I've also gone for a pretty handsome and restrained design language. We have a grille that sort of integrates with the rest of the vehicle. Now, I did find this a little bit tricky to wash this morning. Generally, I do wash the cars before we film, so I'm intimately aware of exactly how rags fit in the nooks and crannies. And some of these nooks and crannies are a little bit more difficult to clean because of the way that Subaru has decided to insert these black plastic chunks, especially around the fog lights right there, and the way that grille integrates with the rest of the body. On the other hand, we have fantastic headlights. Subaru has gone in an interesting direction with the Crosstrek. They've made a ton of stuff standard, so that way they don't have to worry about inventory issues and having a base model that's stripped down hanging out in the lot. So the LED headlights that steer in the corners are 100% standard on every trim in North America. And that means this quite simply has some of the best standard headlights, even in vehicles that cost 3 or 4 times as much as this. Even if you live in town, these headlights are going to be an advantage, but if you live out in the country like I do, these are absolutely essential on winding mountain roads in the dark, and they swivel not just for the low beam, they also swivel when they're in high beam mode. When it comes to the active safety systems, let's cover that first, because up front we don't have a 360-degree camera, and we don't have a radar sensor, and that's because Subaru puts all of their active safety sensors for the forward direction of the vehicle right here behind the windshield glass. We have 3 separate camera modules, and those are used for features like autonomous emergency braking, pedestrian detection, the lane centering system, and adaptive cruise control functionality. Everything is done by those 3 cameras there. That means that if you are in a minor fender bender, or if you want to modify the front end of your vehicle for whatever reason, rally lights, something like that, then it is not going to affect the functionality of the adaptive cruise control like a radar sensor would. The rest of the standard and optional active safety suite on the Crosstrek is pretty conventional. We have radar sensors in the back, and we have typical ultrasonic sensors back there for the parking sensors. You'll notice that even in this trim, however, we don't have parking sensors up front. Before we move on, I should mention the base price. This is $26,290, including destination. All-wheel drive is, of course, standard on every Subaru except for the BRZ. The Crosstrek used to be the least expensive entry in this segment, especially when you considered all-wheel drive, but now that award goes to the 2024 Kia Seltos. It's about $500 less expensive in its base format. Because of the value proposition offered by the Crosstrek and that Kia Seltos, I'm actually going to be talking a lot about the Seltos in this video because they're 2 different ways of attacking high value and, of course, the features and functions that we get in this top-end trim. When creating the Crosstrek, Subaru used the formula that made the Outback such a success. The Outback is in essence a lifted legacy wagon, and this is in essence a lifted Impreza hatchback. And for 2024, the hatchback format was so popular, they just killed off the Impreza sedan. So you can get this basically regular road height or off-road height like you're seeing here. That will go up to 9.3 inches of ground clearance if you get the new Wilderness trim. Any way you slice it, that is a ton of ground clearance in this segment. The competition has been slowly raising their vehicles over time. The average Mazda is now at around 8 inches, the Corolla Cross 8.5 finally, but the Honda HR-V still down there at 6.7. And you're going to really have to buy something much more off-road dedicated and more expensive than this if you want more than 9.3 inches of clearance. The length, however, that is right in line with the larger entries in this segment now. 176.4 inches from that rear end all the way over there to that long hood front end. That's about 4 inches longer than the Seltos or the Bronco Sport because this has more of that wagony or hatchback-like profile, but it's right around the same size as the new Corolla Cross and actually a little bit shorter than the front-wheel drive only Chevy Trax. One big advantage to this format of vehicle, again, same formula that's going on with the Subaru Outback, is that even though we have class-leading ground clearance, we have a much lower roof height. So if you want to put kayaks, bicycles, or things like that on the roof, you're going to want this over the Bronco Sport. This roof line is 8 inches lower. And that means the difference between a ladder or not needing a ladder depending on what you're putting up here on these roof rails. And speaking of the roof rails themselves, these are clearly related to the roof rails we find on the related Impreza, but there has been a little bit of additional strengthening in the roof area and the mount area for the Crosstrek in order to be able to support roof tents and higher loads, especially when driving on these rails versus the lowered Crosstrek. Or I'm sorry, Impreza, because it's not a Crosstrek. Tall one's Crosstrek, low one is Impreza. The one obvious downside to the general profile of the Crosstrek and of course the sloping hatchback here is that cargo capacity is towards the bottom of the segment. This is not exactly the smallest, but it's pretty close when it comes to the cargo area behind the glass. The rugged look continues out back where we find lots of chunky design elements like the chunky black plastic pieces at the bottom of the bumper and these big LED taillights. Well, partial LED taillights actually, because the brake light and the accent light are LEDs, the turn signal and the backup light are incandescent. I think that's a reasonable trade for the standard steering LED headlights up front. The other thing you'll notice back here are the aero ducts on either side of this lower bumper unit, right on either side of these red reflectors. Those help relieve pressure out back. We also find some little fins down there at the bottom of the bumper. Subaru spent a lot of time trying to reduce aerodynamic drag on the Crosstrek for a logical marketing reason. Some folks are going to shop the base model of this against something like a Honda HR-V, which is going to be front-wheel drive and significantly closer to the ground, and they expect the fuel economy numbers to be basically equal. And that's the interesting thing about the Crosstrek. We'll talk about this more under the hood, but Subaru has spent a lot of time trying to improve the aerodynamics so that this gets class-leading fuel economy numbers tying with a number of the non-hybrid entries, even though this has standard all-wheel drive. And that's why we find passive aero treatments up front, like ducts in front of the front wheels, ducts behind the front wheels, some dedication to aero treatments under the vehicle, and then these air releases back here in the rear. With the obvious exception of the WRX, Subaru has by and large resisted turbocharging their smaller vehicles in North America. So instead of a small displacement turbo under this hood, or obviously an optional big displacement turbo, we find two different naturally aspirated boxer engines under here. The first one is a 2-liter unit producing 152 horsepower, 145 pound-feet of torque. It'll get you 0 to 60 around 9 seconds, pretty similar performance to a base Honda HR-V. If you want a bit more oomph, you want this engine. It's a 2.5-liter boxer, and that bumps power up to 182 horsepower, torque to 178 pound-feet. Both engines are mated to a standard continuously variable automatic transmission. No manual transmission is offered in the Crosstrek anymore. If you get most of the Crosstreks, you can tow 1,500 pounds. If you get the Wilderness Crosstrek, that jumps up to 3,500 pounds because it uses a different final drive ratio on the continuously variable automatic. And that is going to drop your fuel economy down, so that's certainly one thing to keep in mind. If you get the base engine, you'll average 34 miles per gallon on the highway, 33 on the highway if you drop down to this 2.5. The combined fuel economy is only 1 mile per gallon lower, even though we get that extra power. But if you choose the Wilderness trim with the all-terrain tires, the different final drive ratio, etc., that drops even further down to an important 29 miles per gallon on the highway, making it one of the less efficient naturally aspirated options in this segment. Much like the Outback, the driving position in the Crosstrek is a bit more relaxed and a bit more sedan-like compared to something like the Bronco Sport, which is more traditional SUV, a bit more upright. So you notice my legs are a little bit stretched out in front of me. You definitely have to reach out a little bit further for the steering wheel. You can lift this seat up, but if you try and get close to the driving position that you'd get in a Bronco Sport at my height, then my head starts touching the ceiling, but some shorter folks will definitely be able to get a better eye line in here. And remember that the entire vehicle is higher off the ground, so your seating position and your eye line is still higher than it would be in a Subaru Impreza. We have a manual tilt telescopic steering column with a large range of motion, power driver's seat in this trim with a 2-way adjustable lumbar support, but this passenger seat, it's still a completely manual design. Jumping into the back seat, you'll notice that we have a decent amount of legroom back here, but again, everything is formatted a little bit differently than some of those upright competitors. Again, like that Bronco Sport, since that is the tallest and the boxiest of the group. Rear seat legroom, definitely solid, about 3 inches or so with this front seat adjusted for me at 6 feet tall. You might be able to squeak a rear-facing child seat in here, but it's going to depend on exactly how the driver up front has themselves situated. The seat bottom cushion back here is a little bit closer to the ground than some of the boxier competition. That means this could be more comfortable for children, but adults might find it a little bit taxing on longer journeys. Moving over here to the middle, we have a pretty wide bench seat in the back, lots of headroom back here. I have about 3/4 of an inch of headroom in the middle, even though this seat is considerably higher off the ground than the outboard seating positions. If I move over here to the right, this seat's all the way back in its tracks. I have about 1/2 inch of legroom left, and you can see I have a decent amount of headroom, even if I put my head all the way back there to the headrest. Clearly, there are pros and cons to a bunch of different vehicle decisions. One thing you should know back here is that we do find a pretty decent bulge right here in the middle because this has the optional moonroof, and no version of the Crosstrek is going to have rear seat air vents. I do think that's a bit of a miss, especially in the top-end trims, because we do find rear air vents in a reasonable number of the competition, although it's worth noting not all of them offer that feature. We do, however, have USB charge-only ports right there. We also have decent cup holders right here in the middle of a soft padded armrest, but then again, we do have that shoulder belt coming out of the side of the cargo area, which we're going to talk about in a bit. If you have kids in child seats, you probably know that the middle seat is the safest place for them, so Subaru gives us another latch anchor right here in the middle. This allows you to use this latch anchor in the center and the outboard latch anchor on that other seat to put a child seat right in the middle of the rear seat pack. Now, on the downside, it can interfere with that seatbelt buckle over there for the right side rear passenger, but I appreciate that touch in addition to the outboard latch anchors we find in the left and right seats. If I could change one thing about this design, I wish that Subaru had given us a bit more of a vertical hatch, although that probably would have compromised fuel economy. The result is that we have a somewhat triangular shaped cargo area, so a big boxy item is not going to fit as well in here as some of those boxier alternatives. And you should know that the cargo opening itself is a little bit shorter than the Bronco Sport. The Bronco Sport doesn't just have a higher roofline, it has a taller body, and that means you can put bigger cargo items inside. In our 24-inch roller bag test, I was able to fit 3 of those larger roller bags back here, but they won't go in the position that this smaller 22-inch bag is sitting in. This is as big as you can put on the side here and still close the hatch. But there is kind of a problem that I should mention as well. If you are planning on putting bags all the way to the side, the rear shoulder belt for the center seat position comes out of the side of the cargo area rather than the ceiling or the seat back, and that means that if you have luggage in here, it's actually going to be hitting that shoulder belt right there. And I do have some concerns about how that might compromise crash safety if you were fully loaded and you did have someone in the middle. Subaru definitely prefers a consistent interior design language, so most of these components are very similar, if not exactly the same, as the ones that we find in the larger and more expensive Subarus in North America. At the top of the windscreen, we find that tri-module camera setup I mentioned earlier, and the controls for this pretty normal-sized moonroof just over the driver and front passengers' heads. You can see that it's not a panoramic design, and the opening is a little bit on the small side, I have to admit. The driver and front passenger get height-adjustable shoulder belts and two-way adjustable headrests. You can see that this interior has a two-tone upholstery scheme going on with contrasting orange stitching right there in the middle of those 2 different colors. The rear seats also get that contrasting stitching, and both rows of seats have the little orange accents inside that honeycomb pattern perforation section. Neither the front row nor the back row are ventilated, just the front row seats are heated in this trim. Moving back up front, you'll notice that the bolsters are not terribly aggressive for the seat back and seat bottom cushions, so larger folks shouldn't have any troubles finding a comfortable driving position. The front doors are made from a combination of different materials. We find some soft touch plastics around that armrest and of course the upper section of the door as well, but the majority of the front of the door and the lower section of course is made from a hard plastic to help improve durability. The front door bottle holders are large and deep, so they should have no problem with some of those larger water bottles. And you'll see from the badging on that speaker grille that we have the up-level audio system in this model. The imitation carbon fiber trim spans from the doors on over to the dashboard, and it has a little bit of a texture as well to give it a bit more interest. This section is a hard plastic that has a rubbery coating on it. We then have a soft touch plastic for the upper section of the dashboard, including that hoop that basically spans from one speaker grille all the way onto the other side. Lower on the dashboard, of course, we have harder plastics to help improve durability, for instance, around this glove box. And on the inside of the glove compartment, I was just barely able to fit an 11-inch tablet computer. In the middle of the dashboard, we find the big LCD infotainment system. This is definitely a defining feature of this interior. As we see in a few other Subaru models, this large vertical screen is not standard. If you get the base version of the Crosstrek, you get a somewhat unusual twin 7-inch screen in the dashboard. It gives you just about as much screen real estate as this, and I have troubles believing it's actually less expensive, so I'm surprised that Subaru gives us two different dashboards. This screen is, however, the one you're going to find in almost every Crosstrek on the dealer lot. Up here you can find navigation readouts, a few auxiliary gauges, things like that, the weather. Down here we have smartphone integration. It is wireless, and you can see it occupies the large format, really contracting a lot of the car controls down here. We have most of the climate control controls on the screen itself, but we do have some temperature adjustment buttons on either side, physical button for the front defroster, and then of course the volume tuning knobs. Those are physical knobs as well. Below the touchscreen, we find the USB inputs for the system, a regular USB and a USB-C, also an auxiliary input, something we don't see in too many vehicles these days. We then have a Qi wireless charging mat down there, and it was able to power my smartphone through its thicker case. Back here we have a pretty traditional shifter. Drive is all the way down there. If you want to engage the manual mode, you push it over to the left, and then the paddle shifters on the back of the steering wheel will hold the gear a bit longer. They do work without it being in manual mode, but it will then default to drive after a short while. We then have toggle switches for the heated seats. Some people really love this because if you live in a really cold climate, the heated seats just stay on since it's a physical toggle rather than a button that will reset every time you turn on and off the car. We then have an electric parking brake right there, two pretty decently sized cup holders. This vehicle uses essentially the same Subaru key that we find in the rest of the lineup. You can see big Subaru logo right there for the unlock button. Going back to the cup holders over here, we have removable inserts so that we could put those taller drinks inside, and then we have a 12-volt power outlet right there. I do think this is an odd spot for one because your drinks could obviously splash on that. Between the driver and the front passenger, we find a really softly padded armrest. That's a nice touch. Opening that, we find a huge storage area under there. You could put a gallon of milk inside and still close that lid. Likely for cost reasons, Subaru bucks the trend of big LCDs on the driver's side, so instead we get an analog instrument cluster for the most part, speedometer over here, tachometer there on the left, and then we find a small color multifunction display in the middle. That mainly gives us things like our trip computer readouts, a few navigation readouts, and some audio readouts as well. In this trim, we have a round leather-wrapped steering wheel with attractive orange accents. You'll find the paddle shifters on the back of the steering wheel, down over there on the left, up on the right. On the left side of the steering wheel, we have mostly our infotainment buttons, so things like voice command, volume up, down, track forward, backward, and then this toggle relates to the trip computer on that small LCD. Then on this side, we find the controls for the adaptive cruise control system. We also find basically the drive mode selector here, the intelligent mode and the sharp mode for the transmission. You can see that indication right up there on that small LCD. Before we get this out on the road, let's talk tires and curb weight. All Crosstreks will have 225 width tires. They'll be 17 or 18s depending on the trim, and the curb weight is relatively high for a base model at 3,276 pounds and will go up to just under 3,400 pounds. Generally speaking, that's a light curb weight for an all-wheel drive entry in this segment, but if you're comparing this to base front-wheel drive competitors, something like the Seltos will be an important approximately 300 pounds lighter, and some of the competition can be even lighter than that with the same amount of power on board. So keep that in mind when we're talking about the slow performance figures that you will find on the base Subaru. The Crosstrek, honestly, like many Subarus, appears to be designed exactly for my demographic. I live out in the woods, but I live pretty close to a major metropolitan area. I drive on roads like this on a regular basis. This road is actually right next door to me, and the paved road and the unpaved roads that you see in all of the videos are roads that I drive on every single day. The Crosstrek, of course, is definitely tuned more towards the off-road side of things, more towards this kind of road surface right here. This is a pretty rugged trail. It hasn't been worked on in quite some time. The ruts on either side can be 7 or 8 inches deep. Then something like the Kia Seltos. The Seltos has a reasonable amount of ground clearance, and again, I keep talking about it in this video because it's also inexpensive, but the suspension setup in that vehicle is certainly more geared towards on-road style driving, and you will notice that on trails like this. This is still pretty comfortable. Obviously, it doesn't feel like a wet noodle on the road, but when the going gets a little bit rougher and the road surface is not perfect, we have potholes, we have dips, maybe a small twig in the road, etc., this is absolutely not a problem. Rather, unfortunately, the one problem with this particular trail today is that tree that's right in front of me, so even though this does have a low roof height, roof height rather, I can't continue. But this is actually where the more compact dimensions of the Crosstrek make a lot of sense, because I can just back this up on this trail. Absolutely not a problem. Nice and easy to navigate around. Let's just go ahead and back this back out. And that's the other thing we should talk about, Subaru's all-wheel drive system. It is a permanent all-wheel drive system. Subaru sometimes calls this symmetrical all-wheel drive. That really just has to do with the geometry of the system, not its functionality. Because you will find more aggressive lockups as far as the center coupling in a number of the competitors, including entries like the Seltos and the Kona, because there you can command more of a full lock to that coupling. It will certainly send more power to the rear without slip. This, however, tries to send most of the power to the front axle under most conditions. Even if I engage X mode here, it actually tends to be a little bit more focused on powering the front wheels. It will send 60% of the power to the front, 40% to the rear for most conditions, and you will find a more firm lock in something like the Compass or the Bronco Sport. Those do take things to the next level. But for 99% of situations, this has a really great feel to it. And because the all-wheel drive system is standard, you don't have to step up to the more expensive models to get it. That's really something that I appreciate. As we head out to the paved road, I should talk about the ride quality first. I give this an A+, because again, we have a bit more ground clearance, a bit more dedication to off-roading and rough-roading ability. This is the kind of entry that you can live with for an hour or 2 hours on a rough road like this, or a trail out on the national park scene, something along those lines. Not that long ago, I drove around the entire island of Iceland, and I was thinking to myself, that would be the perfect place for a Subaru, because a lot of those roads are on the rough side. They're not overly paved, they're just a gravel road like the one that I'm on here, and this deals with this kind of road surface very, very well. Something like a Mazda CX-30, it's definitely going to knock your teeth out. We have the ground clearance in that model, we have a reasonable all-wheel drive system, but the suspension is very, very firm. Of course, when you get this fully out of the paved road, some folks are going to be a little bit sad about the acceleration. It takes some time to get up to 50 or 60 miles an hour. If you get the base engine, 9.1 seconds is how long that will take. I was able to snag one from a local dealer, and the acceleration time is definitely glacial. And to be honest, I had expected this model to go a little bit swifter 0 to 60 as well. This one I had sort of expected would be mid 7 seconds. It actually took 8.1 seconds for this to go 0 to 60. So it is a second faster than the 2-liter engine, but it's not exactly a speed demon. If you want something peppier, you're going to have to look at the turbocharged entries, like the up-level trims of Seltos. You could look at the hybrid Corolla Cross. That actually is quite an interesting option because you get hybrid fuel economy and extra performance. But it's worth noting that not every competitor has a higher horsepower turbocharged option. Also, not every competitor is going to be lighter, and not every competitor is going to have wider tires, which is why the 122-foot 60-0 stopping distance is perfectly acceptable for a small crossover in the US. Handling, on the other hand, that is a bit of a teeter-totter thing going on. Remember I talked about the ride quality, it's fantastic, the ground clearance is high. The counterpoint to that, of course, is the handling ability. Handling and ride quality are often two ends of a teeter-totter, and that's certainly something that we see here. If you start to push this harder in the corners, you're really going to notice that the body starts to lean more than some of the competition. The tires also give up a little bit earlier, and sometimes it can feel a little bit heavier and a little bit, I guess, top heavier is probably the best way to describe it. This obviously does not feel like a Bronco Sport when you really start throwing that model in the corners, because that certainly is more top heavy. But the softer suspension, the more compliant suspension, and the better ride quality here mean that it's going to be a little bit less focused on winding road driving dynamics. And again, I think that's just fine by me. Cabin noise, that is unfortunately something that Subaru doesn't seem to have changed much with this generation of Crosstrek. I measured 72.5 decibels in here at 50 miles an hour. This is not one of the quieter cabins in this segment. Maybe that's because of the relatively low pricing, but I had hoped that it would become a little bit quieter in this generation. That doesn't appear to have happened. Also, if you are accelerating, especially from a stop, you're definitely going to get a lot of that sound into the cabin. Let's go ahead and put it back to normal mode there. Takes a while to get things going. Right around 4,000 RPM, we get the oomph. And then from a stop, we just get that acceleration because the CVT is helping us out there. It doesn't do those imitation shifts. That is obviously going to get you faster 0 to 60, but it's going to annoy some folks that don't really care for that sound of a boxer engine. Subaru has improved that sound. This is certainly less harsh, more refined than the previous generations of the boxer engine, but it still has that distinctive sound. Over a week of mixed driving, I've been averaging about 25 miles per gallon in this 2.5-liter model. I'm going to give this an A- when it comes to fuel economy, even though the highway fuel economy is excellent. And that is one thing to know. If you get the 2-liter or the 2.5-liter engine and you're just doing steady-state highway driving, the fuel economy is going to be among the best in this segment. But for mixed driving cycles, city driving, higher speed highway driving, mountain driving, etc., you will certainly notice better fuel economy in some of the competition, especially the hybrid entry, which is the new Corolla Cross Hybrid. That fuel economy is absolutely fantastic. In our relatively recent test of that model, we averaged 45 to 50 miles per gallon without trying too much. So it is significantly more fuel efficient than this. Hopefully we see a next generation hybrid system in the Crosstrek. It's worth noting that the plug-in hybrid system that we saw last time, that was based on Toyota's hybrid setup, is not available in this generation of the Crosstrek yet, though I wouldn't be surprised if it was coming at some point soon. The Crosstrek is quite simply a very easy vehicle to live with. We have the big touchscreen there for Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. The suspension system, even over that enormous pothole, is really great. It just soaks up those potholes, the speed bumps, etc. Super easy. And it does not become upset over those broken pavement, expansion joints, potholes, things like that, like the Mazda CX-30 and CX-50 can. The firmer suspension tune and the lack of an independent suspension in those Mazda models means that on rougher road surfaces like this, the Crosstrek is simply more composed. It feels like it belongs on these road surfaces. And if you do a long distance drive pretty regularly, then you're going to like this suspension tune as well. For those longer interstate highway journeys, this is my suspension setup of choice. We get the extra ground clearance, we get the softer setup. Everything is really great. If you're the kind of person that does regular road trips, the Crosstrek is also going to be an excellent fit thanks to the softer suspension design. But if you find yourself mainly out in the woods driving on windy roads when the roads are perfect, then you're probably going to want to take a look at some of those Mazda alternatives because they are going to be more engaging to drive.
Once upon a time, the Crosstrek was the least expensive entry in this segment. But with this generation, Subaru has deleted the manual transmission and added a lot of feature content, so now it's actually a little bit above average as far as its base starting price. Let's check out what I think are 3 direct competitors in this segment. The 2024 Seltos is here because currently it's the least expensive all-wheel drive entry in this segment. It's a few $100s less expensive, but you also get a reasonable amount less feature content on the inside versus the next step up in the Seltos lineup. The amount of decontenting is pretty similar actually between the Subaru and the Kia, and that's how they both get to their relatively low all-wheel drive starting prices. But I think the Seltos is a pretty decent value as you start climbing the ladder, because one step up, you get the big 2-screen setup in the dashboard. It's a really attractive look. I also think the Seltos is very handsome. It has definitely become more modern. It doesn't look like the older Kia lineup, and the Crosstrek really hasn't changed its design too much in this generation. If you blink, you might forget exactly what that older Crosstrek looked like, unless you actually parked right next to one. If you want a turbocharged engine, you're going to find that in the Seltos. About 190 horsepower from a 1.6-liter turbocharged engine. It's going to give you generally peppier performance and a more direct feel versus the 2.5-liter engine in the Subaru. You'll also get a real automatic transmission, not a CVT, if you choose the turbo model, and it's going to be a little bit less expensive than the top-end versions of the Subaru. The Honda HR-V is here because it's pretty inexpensive, and Honda has really jammed the lineup together as far as the top-end price and the bottom-end price. They're very, very narrow. $25,425 unfortunately buys you the front-wheel drive model, not all-wheel drive. If you want all-wheel drive, it's actually going to be more expensive than the Crosstrek. And it's a pretty similar story, honestly, in most of the competition. The Corolla Cross, $24,960 for the base model, $26,260 for the all-wheel drive. The big benefit to the Corolla Cross, of course, is its hybrid system. You can, honest to goodness, get over 40 miles per gallon in that model. Treat it gently, you'll get nearly 50. And performance is actually going to be a little bit better depending on the metric versus the top-end version of the Subaru. My main complaints with the Crosstrek are the lack of a hybrid system and the lack of an optional turbocharged engine. I think both of those things would take this vehicle to the next level. Although, depending on exactly what you're looking for, some of these other things may be of interest, like the lack of rear seat air vents. You will find those in a decent number of the competition. Also, you'll find less black body cladding in a lot of the competition. There is a lot of it going on in Subaru's latest lineup, especially when we take a look at the wilderness trims. There's more body cladding than a Star Wars convention going on here. There is a lot of plastic on the outside. But I do like the big LCD on the inside, and you'll find it in basically every trim. The base model has a 2-screen 7-inch setup, which is still quite a lot of screen actually on the inside, so I'm surprised that Subaru didn't just make the bigger screen standard. On the other hand, we have standard all-wheel drive, very aggressive pricing all the way around, and absolutely excellent headlights. If you're shopping in this segment, though, there are still a few other options you should probably consider. The new Hyundai Kona, of course, just came out. Be sure and check out that video. We're waiting on pricing for the 2024 CX-30. That is one of the most fun entries in this segment if you get the turbocharged engine. If you don't get the turbo, I don't really see too much reason to buy the CX-30 though. If you're really interested in fuel economy, there's the Corolla Cross, but if you want even better fuel economy or a plug, there's the Kia Niro. You can get it as a hybrid, a plug-in hybrid, or a full EV, but of course, no all-wheel drive there. And if you're looking for something a little off the beaten path, the Chevy Trailblazer is a pretty solid option. It has a very practical interior, and it's likely going to have pretty aggressive pricing on the Chevy lot. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section, and what would you pick if you're shopping for a small crossover in America right now? Are you interested in the Crosstrek and that sort of station wagon vibe, or are you looking for something a bit boxier or a bit more fuel efficient? Be sure and sound off down there. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't done so. Find us over at Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all those other things, and I'll see all of you next week.